Most formulators in the beauty industry already know that the ingredient petrolatum comes from petroleum. I guess the name is really a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? And this is the ingredient that the beauty industry has already started to feel a little bit self-conscious about. And it's also often the one that gets swapped out in reformulation briefs. Well, I guess everyone probably nods along and feels better about themselves. But what doesn't get talked about nearly as much in the cosmetics industry is that petrolatum is just the obvious example of an ingredient that comes from petroleum. In fact, some of the most celebrated actives in modern skincare, I'm talking about the ones on hero ingredient lists or the ones that drive bestseller claims or the ones that your customers ask for by name, those are often also tied to fossil fuels. The final ingredient might look perfectly respectable sitting in your formulation, but the process that creates it relies on petrochemical derived solvents and reagents and heavy metals that most formulators never think to question. The environmental cost was locked in long before this ingredient reached you on your bathroom shelf or in your formulation lab. So today on the episode, we're pulling back the curtain on the fossil fuels hiding inside your formulations. And we're not doing this to make you feel bad about what you're making or what you're buying, but because understanding the problem is the only way to do something about it. And as it turns out, someone already is. And that's what we're going to talk about on the podcast today. Welcome to Green Beauty Conversations, in which I challenge the beauty industry to become sustainable, champion independent and green beauty, and encourage you to join me in making beauty better. I'm your host, Lorraine Dallmeier. I'm a chartered environmentalist, biologist, and the CEO of award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school, Formula Botanica. We have tens of thousands of students in over 190 countries around the world who study with us to become organic beauty formulators and entrepreneurs. Visit our website at formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. And if you want to be the first person to know what's happening in green beauty, make sure you subscribe to this podcast in your favorite podcast app. So in today's episode, I'm joined by Chris Valencius, the Chief Marketing Officer at Evolved by Nature, which is a biotech company that transforms upcycled silk protein into high-performance peptide ingredients that are designed to replace the petrochemical-derived actives that have underpinned the beauty industry for decades. Chris came to the role after 2 decades leading strategy and creative work for some of the world's biggest consumer brands, from Jack Daniels to Google, and his job now is to translate what a room full of PhD scientists has invented into something that the rest of the world actually wants to buy. Hi, Chris. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really interested in finding out more about what you do. So let's start there. Could you please introduce yourself and the organization you work for our listeners?
Yeah, definitely. I'm Chris Valencius. I am the Chief Marketing Officer of Evolved by Nature. Evolved by Nature is a biotech company. We are mostly preoccupied with taking natural upcycled resources and using proprietary biotechnology tools to turn them into sustainable ingredients for cosmetics and skincare and sustainable chemistry platforms for the fashion industry.
Nice one. Okay, well, that sort of moves into my next question, really, which is what kind of ingredients do you guys make and sell? Can you give us a bit of a flavor?
Yeah, absolutely. So to back up for 1 second, level it up a little bit, our philosophy for ingredient discovery and commercialization is essentially that there's a whole host of active ingredients and functional ingredients in skincare that were really great ideas when they were rolled out basically for our moms, like retinol, ceramides, hyaluronic acid. They definitely are efficacious, but they're not necessarily the most sustainable or circular. They're not necessarily the most adept at leveraging the skin processes that will actually lead to healthier, more youthful skin. And they can often have negative downsides, like kicking off inflammation cascades, really poor stability, and et cetera. So we basically target these ingredients that are these legacy ingredients that really should have gotten better over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and we come up with better alternatives. So we have a collagen promoter that is meant to replace retinol. We have a brightener that would replace your vitamin C and niacinamides and some of the other harsh acids. A barrier booster that is kind of meant to retire ceramides. We have a skin hydrator that is great at doing what HA does, only better and with less of the stickiness and downsides. We have a hair care ingredient that replaces a number of stuff. So essentially, we target the efficacies that everyone really values for obvious reasons. And we just figure out much better ways of getting there.
Nice. So you're effectively flipping the old guard of the beauty industry on its head and trying to reinvent things.
That's the idea, yeah.
Nice. How did you get started? How did Evolved by Nature begin?
It's a pretty interesting story. So the two co-founders, Dr. Greg Altman and Dr. Rebecca LaCouture, met at Tufts University. They were studying silk protein and all the benefits of it, primarily for its use as a medical device. Silk is very biocompatible with the human body, and they were looking at things like how to grow new tendons and implantables and devices, for surgeries. And that really led them on the pathway to this very, very deep dive into silk protein as a sustainable, renewable, natural material that has a lot of potential because, right now the world is full of petrochemicals, right? Synthetics, plastics, all sorts of stuff. All that stuff comes from fossil fuels because if you go into fossil fuels, there's like this whole universe of material in there that you can modify, for good and bad reasons. Aspirin is made from fossil fuels, but so is petrolatum and plastic. Silk is sort of the same. If you can get in there, there's this entire cosmos of like really powerful raw material that you can take out and further design to do all this stuff. And that's really what they discovered. And then they became very preoccupied with actually figuring out how to do that. Silk has been around for, millions of years, but no one's really figured out how to get in there and get the stuff out and then further manipulate it. So that's what they really discovered. And they kind of went from medical devices, surgical devices, to exploring the material for topicals, ingestibles. That led them, to other surfaces. Skin is a surface. So what other surfaces could be more sustainable? So performance textiles, coatings for leather, which is shoes, handbags, and stuff like that. So one thing really led to another. And by chasing the power inherent in silk protein, it really opened up this multi-business unit company because if there's a surface that could be more high performance and more sustainable, there's almost certainly an application for silk in there.
Oh, wow. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners are now thinking, where do you get the feedstocks then for all these ingredients? Where do you find the silk?
Yeah, really interesting. So silk farming, which is called sericulture, has the opportunity to be, a very circular industry, very, focused on regenerative farming. So we identify silk suppliers that use regenerative farming. So essentially, to produce silk cocoons, you need a lot of mulberry trees because that's what silkworms eat. Mulberry trees stay in the ground season after season, so you're not tearing up the ground like you are with like a lot of monocrops. So it's really great for land management. It sequesters carbon. And we look for suppliers that don't use petrochemical pesticides because that can end up in the silk protein. Obviously, we don't want that. So, we keep it very natural, very regenerative. The silkworms basically soak up sunshine. The mulberry trees are irrigated with rainwater. The worms eat the leaves, soak up some sunshine, and then they make this amazing material. Like every silkworm is this really incredible tiny miniature reactor that makes this material that no one has ever figured out how to synthesize with fidelity. But the silkworms already do it, and we just use them instead of building a giant energy sucking reactor that would require, tons of corn or sugar or other petrochemical fueled monocrops. We use a silkworm. And the industry that we purchase our cocoons from actually doesn't want the silk. It's their trash product. They raise the worms primarily as a food source for fish and other marine life. Obviously, we all know fish like to eat worms. It's better than eating like corn or something. So they take the worms, feed it to the fish. We take the cocoons, which are their trash product, and we're able to upcycle that into our ingredients. And by vetting the suppliers, we can ensure that everything is cruelty-free. We have a Leaping Bunny cruelty-free certification. And again, we ensure that, there's no petrochemicals used at the farm.
Well, I was going to ask about the cruelty-free aspect because I think the silk industry has historically had quite a bad rep. People often think about the silkworms being boiled alive, but from the sounds of things, you wouldn't have Leaping Bunny certification if that was happening here, I presume.
Yeah, correct. So the process to make silk textiles is really neither sustainable nor cruelty-free, because you're absolutely right. It's a process called reeling, where the cocoons are essentially boiled in a vat of chemicals with the worm alive in there. It's a little bit grisly, but they do that because they need to get the silk fiber in one unbroken strand, because they're using it to make textiles. We don't need an unbroken strand because we liquefy it anyway, and then we break down the peptides and the proteins to make our products. So for us, the cocoons don't have to be one unbroken strand. So the founders of the company worked really closely with an entomologist out of Harvard to understand, the biology and the life cycle of silkworms. And then they identified a point in the life cycle of the silkworm where essentially it's in its transition to a moth. At that point, it has it's basically been liquefied. There's a little DNA marker in there that reprograms the liquid into, the moth. But at that point, there's no nervous system. There's nothing that can feel anything. And then, the worms are removed by hand. They're cut out. The cocoons are cut open. And then the worms are removed by hand, and they're essentially like slowly dehydrated to turn into fish food. But a result of that is they never feel anything. They're in a point of stasis. They're asleep, and they never feel anything. There's no pain. We went to really great lengths to, confirm this and audit our suppliers, which is how we got the Leaping Bunny certification.
Well, I mean, fun fact, I'm married to a lepidopterist. He loves his moths, and we were having a whole conversation about this. So led to some interesting dinner time chats, actually, when I said I was going to interview you. Talk me through what happens next. You've got the silk proteins, you've processed these cocoons. How does that go from I've got these silk proteins and peptides to now I've got this whole array of ingredients that effectively replaces all the actives that are currently popular in the cosmetics industry?
Yeah, it is really interesting. So we take the cocoons, we remove a protein called sericin, which can be an allergen to some people, and we separate that out, get rid of it. And then we take the remaining proteins, and we basically have a proprietary process by which we filter it into various different proteins. It comes out, and then, I can't get it too much into the specific methodologies and tools because they're, super IP protected for obvious reasons. But then that those various batches of filtered proteins go to our scientists, where they go in, in our R&D lab, and they go in and they basically identify amino acid chains that can then, and then they, manipulate them, do what they have to do. So those amino acid chains become basically bioactive amino acid chains. So amino acid chains that engage with your skin's natural biological processes. And then once those amino acid chains are identified and created and confirmed in the lab for the mechanism of action, like we have an ingredient that boosts collagen. We have another ingredient that boosts a protein called claudin, which is the tight junction protein that your skin barrier uses to keep the cells locked together. So we verify that. And then once the mechanism of action is verified, we go into a scale-up process so that we know that we can make this stuff at the right volumes to support real brand customers, and that we can make it at the right price points for real brand customers. Because, a lot of the petrochemical derived and supported ingredients, we have to compete with them on price, and the petrochemical industry is highly subsidized, so you can have something that works really well and you can have something that's natural, but if your magnitudes of order are more expensive than the alternative, there's not going to be any adoption. So we really do consider the scale-up process as part of, really critical to the whole R&D process, almost as critical, to the biotech aspect of it, because you can have great science, but if people can't afford if you can't make it, and if you can't reproduce enough of it, if people can't afford to put it in a moisturizer, then what was the point of making it?
Well, you just alluded to something I wanted to come on to, actually. Most of our listeners are formulators or work in the beauty industry. Many of them really know their ingredients. But when you first got in touch with us to come on the show, you were talking about something that most of our listeners probably don't know. And you've just alluded to it with the petrochemical industry. What is this dirty secret that's hiding in some of these iconic skincare actives then?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's sort of the dirty secret of, basically everything. You look around your room, everything is made with petrochemicals. We kind of have the very ambitious goal to, put the petrochemical industry out of business someday. There's 80,000 chemicals that we need to replace, and I think we're on number 14, but we'll get there. Because everything is so reliant on these petrochemical supply chains, it's really hard unless you really go back to the drawing board and the foundations of the supply chain. It's really hard to get them out of there. For example, retinol in and of itself is not like a toxic chemical. I mean, no one would consider it toxic. It kicks off an inflammatory cascade in your skin, so we would consider it like, not healthy per se, but it's not officially a toxicant as recognized by the regulatory board. But so the end product is not a toxicant, but when you look at how you make it in the whole supply chain, so it's very resource intensive, it's energy intensive, it requires a lot of hazardous and non-renewable materials, solvents, very strong acids and reagents, metals, things like acetone and stuff to actually create the ingredient. So along the way, you have to create all of those things, which is, the big petrochemical plants that you see next to rivers all over the place, and then you have to use those things, and then they can end up, contacting humans, they can end up in wastewater, things like that, and that's all part and parcel to making the ingredient, so that's pretty much involved in any of the legacy ingredients. Ceramides can require petrochemical derived ingredients and high levels of energy, so basically, if it's a chemical that's synthetic, created at scale, it's almost certainly involved. It requires a petrochemical industry. And then you look at the more natural things like your bakuchials and stuff, which it's not a petrochemical, but it's not really harvested in like the most sustainable way. No one's really considering like the land management of the whole thing and things like that. So you really our thesis is, we want to advance human health. So it's the health of people's skin, the health of the environment that they live in. So really, like from the very beginning, use the precautionary principle all the way through. If it could potentially harm somebody, figure out a different way to do it.
So, I mean, the internet is awash with people talking about these actives. You go onto TikTok, you've got these so-called skin intellectuals who put out all these reels about hyaluronic acid and ceramides and retinol and all the things that they think are going to magically bring about the fountain of youth. Why don't people know about the fact that this comes from fossil fuels? I know this is quite a big question and maybe you can't speak on behalf of the entire industry, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's really interesting because it's readily available information. It's not like this is like some black box secret where, someday someone's going to release, a box of files and it's going to blow everyone's mind. You just Google this stuff. I think the reason no one really talks about it is because it's what's used. There's no alternative, which is really why we consider that the reason why Evolved by Nature exists. Because once you have alternatives, you can say, oh, now that I've learned about this, I can go and get this other thing that's better. Right now, there's not a lot of alternatives to retinol and ceramides and hyaluronic acid. So that's why there are these legacy ingredients that have just been with us and with the industry for so long. And we really consider it kind of a disservice to formulators because you have all these like really amazingly talented, creative formulators, and they're just sort of being forced to use the same tools for year after year after year after year, and there's really this like lack of innovation where it's like, okay, you get a brief for something where they're calling for real sustainability. Do you have tools for that? Or why can't petrochemical free be a claim that we offer people and things like that? So it's really sort of like the lack of options that, again, kind of what I hit on a little earlier, that are as efficacious or more efficacious that can be created at scale to support real brands and that can be provided at the right cost, because sometimes the alternatives come around and it's like, well, it's a couple of people in a lab somewhere, they can't make 100 kilograms to support the brand, or, the stuff is atrociously expensive, because it's not scaled up, or, it hasn't been around long enough to have a robust enough safety profile to make, all the, the global regulatory systems comfortable with it.
Yeah, I get it. I suppose the first step in changing hearts and minds around some of these actives, because in part the beauty industry is also driven by consumer demand, which has been driven historically by the beauty industry. It's like you said, they're legacy ingredients. We just go around in a spiral where people want them and therefore the beauty industry provides them. But to break out of that, you need some pioneering brands who are going to go, we're going to try something different. So what's the uptake been like so far with Evolved by Nature?
Yeah, the uptake has been really positive. I think, there's always the initial hurdles when you're launching something new, particularly in B2B way, where you inherently have to partner with somebody else to engage a customer. So there's a lot of training that gets involved, around the benefits and the value propositions and how to incorporate it and that sort of stuff. So there's always a little bit, it can take a little while to get the plane off the ground, but it's been really well. It's gone really well because, the ingredients are really easy to formulate with. They come in at the right cost. They offer these really great claims. For example, all our ingredients will bind to skin. So you can now have a collagen promoter that can be applied in a facial cleanser. So there's a lot of brands that are like, I can really use this to unlock innovation, and I think we love formulators. Like formulators tend to really get it. They understand it. Where we find we have to, occasionally get into more training is like getting marketing departments at larger brands to understand the benefit of this and how to do this, because I'm probably going to not attribute this quote correctly. In my memory, it's Steve Jobs, but I'll have to Google it later. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I think it was Steve Jobs or something like Steve Jobs that basically said the customer doesn't know what they want. It's your job to tell them. Because no one knows what to ask for if they haven't envisioned it yet. And I think a lot of times, marketing departments in particular, they can be looking at consumer research and stuff that says oh, well, people want retinol. And it's like, right, because retinol is here.
And you've told them that they want retinol as well, right?
Yeah. They're not going to know that they want something that hasn't been introduced yet to them yet, so there's always that dynamic, and you have to get people comfortable, and you have to find those brands that are like, look, I want to be a first innovator. I want to be an early adopter of this stuff, which we have, which is great, because you have to get it going. But I think there are obviously big advantages to also being the first adopters of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So how do you validate the performance of the actives and the ingredients that you're making against some of these, I suppose, benchmarks really that they're replacing? Yeah,
so we go through a very robust R&D process before we launch an ingredient, because unfortunately, I think there's been a lot of sort of biotech companies and biotech adjacent companies that I think have sort of maybe not established the most legitimate reputation for the field of study, because they've launched and gone out of business or what have you, or the ingredient didn't really do what it said it was going to do. So when we discover something in the lab, hey, this thing is upregulating filaggrin in skin, this could be a hydrator, for example. We have the confirmatory data, and then we go through pretty robust lab studies around the mechanism of action, bringing cell cultures, that sort of stuff. Just, keep running the studies. Like, have we confirmed that it's doing it? We will often generate scientific imagery that we can look at, before and after. You can see that the protein is there with particular cameras and staining technologies and stuff. And then we validate the mechanism of action, and then we figure out, hey, is this dose dependent? Because if it's dose dependent, that means, you're really onto something. We validate that. And then once that's all validated, we then move on to, outside the lab trials, clinical trials on people. With our ingredients, we typically do, a 24 to 48 hour study, 7-day, a 14-day, and a 28-day. Our ingredients tend to work very fast because they leverage processes that your skin wants to engage in already. So we do that, and then we get those good clinical results, out, in real people where it's appropriate. Like people, if you have a brightening ingredient, did you do all the Fitzpatrick types, that sort of stuff. We make sure that all our clinical protocols, which we do ourselves, we have a whole clinical function. We make sure that they're all, the clinical protocols are all, IRB approved so that they're very legitimate, and then from there we often go into benchmarking. So to your point, we'll then say okay, we're going to go head to head with our 27P ingredient against, the equivalent dose of retinol. And then, we'll do those studies, 7, 14, 28 day. We'll, benchmark our barrier booster against ceramides.
So it's a lot of work going on by the sounds of things. Can you just paint a picture for me? How big is the team? How big is the undertaking?
Yeah. So we're a pretty small team. Company is probably about 80 people. We have, as I said, we have multiple business units: cosmetics, sustainable chemistry for the fashion industry. We have some, just the raw discovery team. We're not a huge team, but the whole philosophy, which sounds like a no-brainer, but it's part of the reason that I wanted to, come here 6 years ago, is it's find very, very capable, very, very creative people that are not assholes. And then put them in a building and have them all work together. It's a really, again, it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's a very, very productive ecosystem because you have people that are, subject matter experts and then very creative thinkers. The science team is super creative. Our marketing team is super creative. The people that have to scale things up and figure out how to get the ingredients to every market in the world are very creative. So we put a high premium on that. And then basically, you just hire people that are very adept at just working in high functioning teams. We don't hire a lot of egomaniacs. There's not a lot of people running around in black turtlenecks. It's everyone just rolls up their sleeves and says look, we have 80,000 petrochemicals that we got to replace. So what are we doing this morning to get at it?
I love it. I mean, to be fair, 80 is actually larger than most of the ingredient suppliers that come on the podcast here. Typically, the people I interview have fewer than 10 people on the team. And I love the arsehole comment. That's my favorite topic to do with HR, and that's a whole separate podcast.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just wanted to ask, I mean, you're effectively asking an industry to walk away from ingredients that are deeply entrenched and well understood and cheap, as you alluded to, and we know that they work. How fast do you think the industry will make that shift?
I think there's, oh man, I wish I could remember. There's a term for this. I wish I could remember. But, things always feel slow until they get really fast. It's if you look at the curve of progress or, change within industries, it's always very flat or it's incrementally going up for a while. And then it just hockey sticks and shoots right up because there's the tipping point because with any kind of systemic change in an ingredient, it is really you reach a certain number of adopters and a certain number of awareness, in the market, and then it just is. And then it just does, and that's when it just goes, way up. It was
I think it's the S curve, possibly.
It might be, but it's I'm old enough to remember this. I'm not going to assume everyone in the audience is, but when iTunes came out and the iPod was new, it was the weirdest thing on earth, and
it was,
and it was very strange and no one knew how to, it was how do I get my music on there? And then it was, within 12 months, everybody on earth had one, and I think that's just how it works with anything that's legacy. There's always a little bit of trepidation, but then when it changes really fast and it changes very systemically.
Well, let's see what's going to happen in the beauty industry. It'll be really interesting to see if they do, when they do finally make that shift away from those classic legacy ingredients, as you call them. So for any sort of independent formulators or small brands who are listening right now, what are your minimum order quantities? How would they work with you?
We have pretty low minimums. So for the most part, it's a kilogram of ingredient. We want to support brands of all sizes, and I've kind of brought up scale up a number of times. We want to make enough to support the very big brands, but we also want to be able to provide samples and material to the small brands, because a lot of times it's those brands that don't exist right now that become, the most influential brands, by
very true,
by the end of, the year. So we like to work with up and comers. So we want to make sure that we can get them samples, that we have low enough MOQs that they can afford to adopt it. If they're making those product runs of, 1,000 units, 3,000 units, that sort of stuff. We want to be able to support that.
I guess the final question I want to ask you is, what's next for Evolved by Nature?
Oh, wow. That is such a interesting question. There's always so much that's next that it's almost like a running joke around here where it's like part of my job as like, strategic marketing and, sort of looking at the strategy behind our product pipeline is part of my job is really to contain our CEO, Greg, because again, the potential of the technology is so vast. If you think of like, it can increase the performance and the sustainability of just about anything with a surface. We can't do anything about sound waves and rainbows because they don't have surfaces, but like almost everything else that's a product has a surface. So there's so much potential, and I think the founders, Greg and Beck, are, they're such deep subject matter experts in this protein and what it can do that it's really easy for them to envision where it can go, so we have horizon levels of innovation. Level 1 is commercialized, 2 is R&D, and 3 is, what we're going to get to next. There's so much in Horizon 3 that has potential, and I can't talk about all of it necessarily for, IP reasons and other things, but we're not going to really run out of interesting and fun things to do. I think on the natural ingredients and the cosmetic side, we're always going to be bolstering the data sets behind our ingredients, figuring out, other clinicals we want to run to support other use cases, we have a hydrogel that we basically know that it could probably boost SPF by helping to evenly disperse filters. So that's a data set that we're going to want to generate. We're always going to be adding to things. And then, we're always going to be discovering new formats. For example, we have 2 hydrogels right now, but the hydrogels is almost a whole separate platform with all these possibilities where, you can modify the core molecule that makes up the hydrogel. And then you have one that's a great emulsifier. Then you have another one that's a great viscosity modifier. We sort of have the opposite problem of a lot of biotechs, where a lot of biotechs discover something and then they commercialize it and then they're like, oh no, we don't know what's next. We sort of have the opposite problem where it's like we have so much what's next. We're else like let's slow down. Let's finish this thing that we just launched.
That's a nice place to be. And you mentioned multiple points throughout the interview that there are 80,000 petrochemicals to replace, and you guys have done 14? So I guess you have 79,986 to go, really.
Yeah,
which is quite an impressive feat. So if people listening want to find out more about Evolved by Nature, where can they do that? So
you can go on our website. There's a lot of information on there right now. It's getting updated as we speak. So there's probably going to be a whole new website in, a month or two. They can always reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions or connect people with our technical team, which is offers formulator assistance, with our orders team if people need samples, things like that. Our regulatory team, if there's any questions there. So we're always happy to engage with people, and I'm happy to take any questions and direct them to the right team member.
Amazing. Well, we'll put the link to Evolved by Nature in the show notes, so you can find that underneath wherever you're listening to this episode. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been really interesting finding out more about what you guys do.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really great conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
All right. Bye.
I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Were you aware of the fact that so many of your skincare actives are derived from fossil fuels? Leave us a comment on our social channels, as both the Formula Botanica team and I love hearing from you. And if you want to hear some more episodes about the topics we discussed today, please do delve back into the podcast archives, because we've got over 8 years worth of episodes sat right there. Some great examples include episode 159, in which I picked apart the claim fossil fuel-free beauty and asked whether it was even possible to claim that for a beauty brand. Ironically, I received a pitch from a beauty brand that later underwent a massive online scandal that saw their downfall, not naming any names. And they wanted to come on and talk to me on the podcast here about being a fossil fuel-free beauty brand. And at the time, their PR agent swore up and down that they could absolutely back up their claims when I told them, basically, that I'd be grilling them within an inch of their lives for making that statement. And then on the day of recording, they all ghosted me. So we went ahead and recorded our own in-house version instead. And that's episode 159. Go and check it out. Or check out episode 160, in which I looked at 10 of the most ridiculous claims made by the beauty industry. Obviously, fossil fuel-free beauty is definitely one of them, as you've learned today too. And this is a really fun episode 160, where I delve into the history books. So do make sure you listen, because it's super entertaining and I really enjoyed putting it together. There's a wealth of information in our old episodes, and I do encourage you to go back and listen to them. So thank you for joining Chris and I for this latest episode of Green Beauty Conversations. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do leave us a 5-star review so that other people can enjoy these conversations too. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever your favorite podcast app is, and stay tuned for the next episode. Follow Formula Botanica at Formula Botanica on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Pinterest, LinkedIn. We're everywhere. And come and give me a follow at Lorraine Dallmeier on Instagram and LinkedIn. Visit our website at formulabotanica.com and sign up for our free online formulation course today.